December 11, 1941. Adolf Hitler rose to speak at the Berlin Opera House and, in a voice sharpened by triumph, declared war on the United States. It was a theatrical moment, meant to codify a new global posture. He mocked American leadership and the country's supposed fragility, its democracy, its diversity, its commercial temperament. To him, the United States was a mongrel democracy, a land of immigrants with no deep martial tradition, safely separated from European affairs by oceans and habit. That public dismissal was not a casual slur, it was an ideological lens. The question that followed for the German High Command, and the question this narrative will trace, is simple but profound. What went through Hitler's mind as the hard facts arrived that America could, in effect, fight always? From that moment, a sequence repeated itself with painful clarity. Belief met evidence, evidence met denial, denial met grudging acceptance, and acceptance led to desperate attempts at compensation. The timeline runs from the Opera House in December 1941 through the grinding confrontations of North Africa and Sicily, through the flood of American production that overwhelmed German operations, to Normandy and the final crossings of the Rhine. Along the way, the same themes returned. Hitler's racial and political assumptions filtered intelligence. Intelligence reported industrial facts, ships, aircraft, trucks, factories. Hitler reacted with scorn, then reinterpretation, then rage, then a brittle admission recorded by those around him. Ultimately, he recognized what his ideology had refused to allow him to see. Industrialized warfare, supplied by an economy that converted steadily to war production, could sustain operations at a tempo Germany could not match. He realized it too late. Hitler's initial mental model of the United States was ideological more than empirical. His world picture had been shaped for decades by racial theories and a contempt for liberal democracy. In Nazi doctrine, nations that were racially pure and politically authoritarian possessed martial virtue. Pluralistic democracies diluted vigor. Distance and the ocean were convenient props in that picture. The Atlantic and Pacific were natural shields, insulating America from the crucible of continental warfare. Moreover, Hitler assumed the United States' industrialism was primarily civilian and consumer-focused, assembly lines for appliances and cars, not an inexhaustible engine of war. This was not the assessment of a general studying enemy production reports. It was the assessment of an ideologue who had built strategic arguments on social prejudices. Yet events pushed rapidly against ideological comforts. Pearl Harbor provoked a kind of perverse satisfaction in Berlin. The United States would be distracted, and, in Hitler's calculus, could be contained by distance if it entered a European war, primarily against Japan. His declaration of war in this light was opportunism. The Reich could declare and expect the U.S. to be protracted in the Pacific. But within months, intelligence and battlefield realities began to complicate the neat picture. Reports arrived of shipyards working at scale unseen in Europe, of aircraft factories running day and night, of the American ability to turn consumer manufacturing into armaments with remarkable speed. The initial German reaction to this inflow of facts was a familiar one: dismissal and reinterpretation. Denial had layers. At one level, there was intellectual skepticism. Allied figures sounded inflated by propaganda, they said. At another level, there was cultural prejudice. A democracy of immigrants could not possibly field the kind of eager, disciplined mass the Wehrmacht prized. And at an operational level, there were selective readings of battlefield setbacks. If American units lost engagements or lacked tactical finesse, those episodes were used as evidence confirming the old theory. Yet the data accumulated relentlessly. Routinely, confidential briefings and intercepted intelligence began to sketch a different map. American tonnage, aircraft replacement rates, and truck outputs were not temporary spikes. They were structural advantages built on industrial depth and a national labor force mobilized for war. One of the first practical shocks came in theaters where material logistics became visibly decisive. Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa in November 1942, produced scenes that left German officers unsettled. American convoys arrived with overwhelming quantities of supplies. Soldiers and staff officers recorded in private notes and later memoirs the astonishment at how quickly empty ports and beaches were turned into self-sustaining logistics hubs. Material replaced losses at a tempo German commanders had not expected. Rommel, who fought in North Africa, observed more than once that Allied resupply, though not without vulnerability, was steady and large enough to sustain long-range operations. According to German staff reports and later recollections by commanders, the Americans did not fight once and then disappear. They continued to flow into the fight with replacements and equipment. Parallel to the operational theater revelations were the raw numbers of industrial output. Allied intelligence and later German briefings that could not be ignored started circulating figures that undermined Hitler's earlier mockery. Liberty ships became a symbol and a practical shock. The United States launched shipyards into a mass production frenzy. The Liberty-class cargo ship was not a technological marvel in itself. Its importance lay in the industrial methods behind it: standardized parts, simplified construction, and assembly line processes adapted to shipbuilding. The result was scale. By the end of the war, thousands of cargo ships had been launched, an output that made it increasingly difficult for German naval warfare to cut supply lines entirely. German intelligence and ministers who later wrote memoirs, notably Albert Speer, took note of the tonnage arriving in Allied ports and how that tonnage sustained further offensives. Aircraft production offered an even more dramatic illustration. Allied air power, particularly the long-range bombing campaigns, relied on numbers. The 8th Air Force's repeated daylight raids over Europe reflected not only tactical doctrine, but enormous production behind it. Aircraft built, replaced, and flown at a tempo Germany could not afford to match. Reports that reached the German leadership cataloged the sheer throughput: thousands of aircraft assembled and delivered within months. It is important to qualify these claims with attribution because intelligence sometimes conflated categories or included training aircraft. Still, the general pattern was unmistakable. Where Germany's industry was increasingly constrained, shortages of oil, metals, and labor, the United States industrial apparatus, mobilized and backed by resources from the Western Hemisphere and Empire, kept turning out machines of war. Trucks and motor vehicles matter in a war of movement, and here too the Americans excelled. Logistics, more than heroics, determined how long an army could maintain campaigns far from home. Replacements for destroyed or worn-out vehicles were critical in campaigns across Europe. German reports and later statements by German industrialists and officers emphasized how Allied motor transport replaced losses swiftly, keeping lines of supply open. Standardization played a role. Where the Wehrmacht often fielded a diversity of vehicle models, complicating maintenance and spare parts, the U.S. system emphasized standard models and interchangeable parts, reducing downtime and increasing operational readiness. This logistical edge multiplied battlefield advantages into strategic momentum. Not all German reactions were purely technical. Hitler's own strategic responses reveal a pattern of psychological defense translated into policy.
When confronted with American material superiority, he leaned on a predictable set of compensations: intensify submarine warfare, attempt to break transatlantic supply lines, invest heavily in so-called wonder weapons rather than reallocating industry to sustain the conventional fight, accuse subordinates and internal enemies of sabotage or defeatism, and frame setbacks as failures of will or treachery rather than root causes in production deficits. The U-boat campaign intensified early on, but in attrition against steadily accelerating Allied convoy systems and escorting air power, it could not nullify the industrial tide.
Meanwhile, massive investment in rockets, jet aircraft, and super-heavy tanks consumed resources and attention that might have marginally slowed the American advance, but could not eliminate the core imbalance. A pivotal moment in the cognitive arc was Albert Speer's briefings in mid to late 1943. Speer, as Minister of Armaments and War Production, found himself in the role of translator between currency of production figures and the Führer's strategic thinking. According to Speer's later recordings and memoirs, the numbers he presented, quantity of ships, aircraft, and vehicles, were factual burdens that demanded strategic response. For some months, Hitler alternated between incredulity and redefinition. The outputs were exaggerated, sabotaged workers had inflated the numbers, or Germany could outfight the material in decisive battles. But the accumulation of verified production reports forced a grudging recalibration. Speer's data did not and could not persuade Hitler to change core ideological positions. Instead, it produced tactical shifts, redistribution of scarce resources to sectors that promised technological miracles, and increasingly harsh control over industry and labor. This sequence, denial to compensation, was visible in the Mediterranean and Western campaigns that followed. In Sicily and then the Italian mainland, the Allies demonstrated not merely numerical superiority, but the political-economic machinery to sustain a long, costly campaign far from American shores. By the time the Allied forces planned and executed the cross-channel invasion in 1944, the logistical gamble was enormous and depended, crucially, on American industrial output. Operation Overlord did not rely solely on tactical surprise. It depended on a prolonged ability to replace men and materiel, to build and operate artificial ports, and to maintain air supremacy through sustained aircraft sorties. The Germans watched convoys, witnessed the build-up of thousands of landing craft, and saw in the flat bureaucratic statistics a story of inexorable reinforcement. It is important to understand the nature of the cognitive barrier facing Hitler. The Reich's leadership had long equated quality, spirit, and shock with victory. That is, elite tactical units and charismatic command could win battles even against superior numbers, but they repeatedly underestimated the multiplier effect of numbers when combined with logistics and standardized training. A single tank battalion of elite crews could achieve local success, but when the opponent replaced losses more rapidly than the defender could, local victories evaporated into strategic exhaustion. That does not diminish acts of valor or tactical skill. It situates them within a system where attrition favored the side with deeper, more resilient industrial capacity. By late 1944, the evidence became impossible to contain rhetorically.
The Normandy landings had established a Western front. Later, the Allied push through France, the liberation of ports, and the maintenance of supply lines demonstrated a steady forward momentum. Crossing rivers like the Rhine, a geographical objective Hitler had counted on as a natural defense, became a matter of speed and engineering backed by endless materiel. Bridges, pontoon systems, mobile repair units, and transporter vehicles moved tons of supplies into forward areas. In the German bunker, aides and secretaries recorded conversations in which Hitler's language shifted. According to Speer and entries in Goebbels' diary, fragments of confession and concession crept into private remarks, acknowledgments that the United States' resources and the Allied system had a scale that made German hopes for reversal less tenable. These attributions must be handled carefully. Hitler did not suddenly embrace the inevitability of defeat with philosophical resignation, but they mark a psychological concession that his earlier model had been incomplete at best and dangerously wrong at worst. What changed his thinking was not a single fact, but the convergence of many. Shipping tonnage that replacement efforts could not fully disrupt, durable air superiority that punished movement and production centers, truck convoys and motor pools that kept fronts supplied, and production pipelines that translated national output into forward combat power. Each of these elements reinforced the others. Industrial production supplied air and sea lift. That lift kept the front supplied. Supply permitted sustained offensives, and sustained offensives forced German reactions and attrition. When numbers move at relational speed, even superior tactical doctrine is overwhelmed. Hitler's ideological lens had not been equipped to measure this systemic quality. Consider the psychological mechanics of this realization. For years, Hitler had interpreted global politics through a narrative where superior racial quality, decisive leadership, and tactical cunning determined outcomes. The role of impersonal systems, factories, assembly lines, logistical supply chains was subordinate in that narrative. When the evidence of mass production confronted him, his cognitive defenses did two things. First, they tried to subsume the facts into pre-existing narratives. Production numbers were exaggerated, or the men supplied lacked fighting spirit. Second, when subsumption failed, the response was to double down on immediate solutions that aligned with the narrative of exceptional weaponry and decisive battles. Pour resources into rockets, jets, and supertanks that promised a qualitative edge. That pivot is revealing. It shows a recognition of a problem. Germany could not match Allied mass, yet a refusal to accept the systemic remedy. Reorganize national industry around conventional attrition and logistics. Instead, Hitler sought technological salvation.
From the operational side, the American military and industrial complex had certain characteristics that transformed production into perpetual fighting capacity. Standardization reduced the time needed for repairs and training. Mass production created spare parts inventories and redundancy. A large, professionalized logistics corps moved supplies reliably. Training systems turned recruits into competent soldiers on a standardized schedule. All these elements produced a replaceability rarely achieved by the Axis. It is useful to think in terms of sustainability rather than mere output. The United States could not win every localized battle by superior tactics. What it could do, with consistent industrial throughput, was sustain operations longer than Germany could. That capacity to absorb losses and replenish them at scale resembled what contemporaries described as an ability to fight always. This phrase, fight always, captures not invincibility, but endurance. It describes a military economic system where production and logistics create a self-reinforcing momentum. Hitler's mental shift was partly acknowledging this endurance. Speer recorded that when confronted with the evidence of American manufacturing power, Hitler sometimes used language that recognized the scale of Allied material reserves and production. Goebbels' diaries show a similar pattern, public bravado mixed with private alarm.
A secretary later recalled conversations where Hitler admitted strategic miscalculations toward the end. Again, those accounts must be presented as reports and recollections, not as transcriptions of inner thought. But the aggregate of those observations paints a picture of a leader who moved from ideological certainty to a troubled awareness of systemic reality. Why did this realization come too late? Several structural and personal reasons explain the tragic lateness. First, the German economy was increasingly starved by resource constraints, synthetic fuel shortages, disrupted raw materials, and bombing that degraded production capacity. No amount of belated reallocation could create the industrial mass the Allies had already built. Second, Hitler's ideological commitments and micromanaging tendencies meant that strategic redirection of German industry was slow, subject to competing priorities, and frequently sabotaged by internal politics and reprisals. Third, the Allies' geographic access to raw materials and production bases, North America, South America, and colonial resources, expanded the strategic envelope in ways Germany could not mirror. All three factors combined to make a corrective strategy both politically and materially implausible in the war's final years. The strategic consequences of Hitler's late recognition are visible in the battlefield arc. German attempts to counterstroke, like the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, sought to seize operational initiative and break the Allied logistical chain through bold maneuver.
Those operations exploited temporary tactical surprise, but relied on material sufficiency that Germany lacked. Even when early gains were achieved, the Allies replaced losses and tightened logistics. The offensives consumed fuel and elite manpower that could not be replaced. Meanwhile, the Allies kept delivering men and machines to the front. Every failed German gamble, every attempt to channel scarce resources into a dramatic reversal underlined the core imbalance. The United States and its partners had built the apparatus to outlast Germany. It can be tempting to reduce this story to simple moral categories. Industrial might beats battlefield genius. That would be simplistic. The German army and its commanders won many fierce combats and displayed tactical brilliance. But industrial warfare is not a single battle. It is a series of sustained operations, each requiring replenishment and repair. When an opponent can replace the consumables of war, men, munitions, machines, faster than they are expended, the strategic picture favors the replenisher. Hitler's mind gradually moved to an understanding of this point, but his ideological armor made acceptance and adaptation slow, half-hearted, and ultimately ineffectual. There is an important difference between Hitler's public and private attitudes during this unfolding. Publicly, he maintained rhetoric of absolute will, blaming generals, saboteurs, or international conspiracies for setbacks. He continued to promise miraculous technologies as salvation. Privately, reports from aides and ministers suggest a more fractured picture, moments of shock, statements that reflected pessimism, and concessions that admitted numerical realities. According to Goebbels's diary entries and Speer's later writings, these private admissions never matured into comprehensive policy changes able to redress the material gap. Instead, they produced a psychology of recrimination and clinging to impossible solutions. One of the most telling dynamics was how Hitler framed technological investment. If production numbers could not be matched, then technological singularities, rockets striking London, jet fighters dominating the skies, super-heavy tanks, might change the calculus. This belief had two flaws. First, those technologies, while significant, could not be produced in the quantities necessary to substitute for systematic production advantages.
Second, developing and deploying wonder weapons consumed scarce resources and diverted skilled labor from conventional production. The strategic logic was thus self-defeating, chasing qualitative edges in hope of compensating for quantitative inferiority often deepened the resource imbalance. The last months of the war reveal how the cognitive acceptance of American endurance translated into bitter reality.
As American troops crossed into the Reich, as factories were overrun or bombed, and as the Rhine barriers were set aside by pontoon bridges and armored columns, the once daunting American shores ceased to appear distant. They were close in a logistical sense, sustained by convoys, airlift, and manufacturing pipelines that stretched continuously toward the front. According to aides who later recounted conversations, Hitler occasionally acknowledged that the United States' capacity for sustained war-making had been underestimated. These admissions, however, came in a context where strategic reversal was impossible. Assessing what went through Hitler's mind is not a matter of attributing precise inner feelings, but of tracing a cognitive trajectory. Early arrogance born of racial and political assumptions produced a misreading of American capacity. As empirical evidence accumulated, shipyards launching hundreds or thousands of cargo vessels, aircraft production measured in the tens of thousands or more, motor transport fleets enabling sustained supply, the ideological picture cracked. Denial and reinterpretation followed. When data could no longer be contained, a grudging recognition emerged. America and its allies possessed a level of industrial endurance that made sustained conflict, on a scale Germany could not match, feasible. In behavioral terms, this recognition manifested as strategic pivots to technological miracles and increasingly harsh domestic measures, rather than a conversion to policies that would have leveled the playing field in a conventional sense. There is also a moral clarity implicit in this analysis. The United States' capacity to fight always was not a neutral attribute divorced from political ends. It was deployed in a coalition opposing the Nazi regime. The industrial might that enabled sustained operations underpinned the liberation of occupied countries and the defeat of an ideology built on racial terror. Recognizing the purely mechanical advantage of production does not substitute moral evaluation. It clarifies how modern war binds factories and front lines into a single strategic theater. Two further points help explain the dynamic at the heart of this story. First, the United States' economic mobilization before and during the war created a scale effect. Once people, factories, and policies were aligned, momentum built on itself. Factories trained workers, workers produced parts, parts became weapons, weapons enabled operations that captured more resources, and those resources fed back into production. It is a feedback loop that can be difficult to stop once it accelerates. Second, the Allied command structure and political cohesion, despite strains and competing national priorities, managed to coordinate logistics at a scale Germany could not match. That coordination turned production into sustained frontline capability. So what precisely moved through Hitler's mind as the reality sank in? The evidence from contemporary diaries, memos, and the accounts of aides suggests a mix of reactions rather than a single epiphany. There was continuing contempt and unwillingness to fully concede that racial or cultural explanations were invalid. There was explicit frustration and fury at those who reported unwelcome facts. There were attempts to reinterpret data in ways that fit existing schemas. And there was finally, in private moments recorded by ministers and secretaries, a grudging acknowledgement that American industrial capacity, translated into ships, planes, trucks, and men, created a sustainability that Germany could not match. That admission was not philosophical resignation so much as a catastrophic recognition.
The strategic environment had shifted in a manner that made Germany's victory unattainable under existing conditions. The final months illustrate the cost of coming to that recognition late. When leaders double down on impossible technological panaceas, when industrial policy is subordinated to political theatricality, and when strategic errors are blamed on scapegoats rather than addressed structurally, recovery becomes implausible. Hitler's late awareness that America could fight always did not produce the institutional reforms or the realignment of resources necessary to alter the outcome. By then, the logistic and material gap was a cumulative fact. Ships had been launched, factories had been retooled, training systems were running, and the Allies' ability to move, replace, and sustain forces had become operationally manifest. In the end, the clear thematic line answers the title directly. Hitler moved from contempt to denial, then to grudging recognition of American industrial endurance, and that recognition arrived too late to change the course of the war. He had underestimated the scale at which industrialized modern warfare operated. His ideological filters slowed the necessary strategic adjustments. His chosen compensations consumed resources without reversing the systemic disadvantage. The United States, through industrial conversion, logistical standardization, and relentless production, proved capable of sustaining a war effort at a tempo and scale Germany could not match. When Hitler finally understood this, his options were exhausted. If this history has a lesson beyond the particulars of 1939 to 1945, it is about the nature of modern war itself. Weapons and battlefield heroics matter, but in an era of mass production, the deeper determinant of strategic endurance is capacity, the factory, the railhead, the port, and the system that connects them. Hitler's intellectual failure was not merely a matter of misjudging a single enemy. It was failing to comprehend that war had become a contest of industrial systems as much as a clash of armies. That failure, ideological, organizational, and psychological, turned what might have been a negotiated or limited conflict into a total collapse.
Before moving on, a small request. If you're into deep historical takes that connect ideas, production, and strategy, subscribe for more. There are deeper readings, Speer's accounts of armaments, Goebbels' diaries, and detailed industrial histories that expand on the dossier of evidence. For now, the essential answer remains. When Hitler finally understood that America could fight always, he was forced to confront the limitations of ideology against industrial power, and that confrontation came too late to alter history's course.